one-on-one learning when it comes to something as important as grit is so important. I think you can obviously teach grit, in larger groups and things like that. But I think if you really, 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 like if it were me, if I really want to teach grit to people, it has to be personalized for me as the learning mentor in that particular situation. And even for myself, I think about like, how can I improve my grit? I think you have to start with interest. I think you have to start with what you're passionate about. We've talked about how Angela Duckworth talks about passion. And I think starting with just being curious and asking, like, what are you passionate about? Hi, I'm Elayna.
And I'm Marissa.
Thanks for joining us.
Let's dive into another exciting episode of Everything is Learning.
Hey, Meme, how are you?
Hello, nice to talk to you again.
Yeah, I'm super excited. I was thinking about our last conversation and then, how we kind of got on this idea of grit and resilience. And I just kept, I was sitting around on Sunday and I just kept thinking about like, gosh, what is it about grit and resilience that like I really want to think about or talk about or, get your perspective on too. And I was just sitting there watching the Bills game.
Oh,
and
oh, big win.
As a
nail
Buffalo
biter.
Bills fan, you know how it goes, right? Because we've been Bills
sure.
fans since birth. And
making it to the Super Bowl 4 times and winning none of them is a really hard road.
It's just, so it made me think about how gritty you have to be a Bills fan and how gritty you have to be on the Bills team or staff and the resilience that it takes, but mostly from the fan perspective. I was just sitting around and I was like, this season has been insane. And that's usually how it is being a Bills fan. Like we like the season starts off and like we're on fire and then
all the tables broken.
We break all the tables because we're so pumped. But like I'm trying to manifest a Super Bowl win this year, so I'm like,
heck yeah,
Super Bowl. Like
we gotta send somebody into that big hole where they're building the new stadium. So won a game, right?
Let's do it. Like it also like it's so hard to be patient. It's so hard to, especially in today's culture when like everything is instantaneous. Like we live in a culture that requires instantaneous results. And
so true. All at your
I
fingertips.
think as a Bills fan, I've learned so much about like grittiness and resilience. But when I like on a real note, it really is like, I think our bandwidth sometimes is like directly tied to our internet bandwidth. I get so frustrated when my internet goes out or like when things don't come up instantaneously. And luckily I've trained myself enough, like, and I've had enough practice where I'm like, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. Remember when we had AOL and we had to use dial-up and it was like, doo doo.
Oh my gosh, yeah, the modem noises.
Like, the modem. Like, some people listening won't even know what a modem is. Like, and I just,
my network connectivity is poor thinking about that.
But it really is like, it's so true. And I just feel like we need to be fostering grit in ourselves as like adults, but also in youth today. And like, we need resilience, but it's so hard to foster it when you're growing up in this time period where not only is it desired to have instantaneous success and access and growth, but like we also need it. Like there's like this need that's neurologically tied to the way that children are growing up nowadays. And
sure.
Yeah, like I just, when it comes to grit and resilience, I want to instill that in any young learner that I work with or any older learner that I work with, and especially myself. Like I'm still working on it. I don't know.
Everything that you had said made me think about, to your point, things being at our fingertips. No one really sees especially on social media, no one really sees the journey. They just see the success. I mean, very
Ooh.
rarely do I see anyone post a failure, and I really appreciate when they do, because it gives, like, it's a humbling experience and requires vulnerability, right? But learning grit requires engagement and activity, and it's the antithesis of passivity. It can't be passively researched and understood from reading, which, is a struggle for me, because as a curious person, like, I like to go and look things up and know things, but that grit is not something that I can learn from just reading a definition or a book. Like, it
Yeah.
requires learned life experience. It isn't something that can be done
Yes.
in a day or one encounter of an action. It requires commitment and repetition. And I think that there's a lot of things that can fuel it, but essentially you have to be present to show up
Yeah.
to learn grit. And seeing pictures on social media of someone who has grit and is posting the success of that grit is different, because you didn't see all the steps it took to get there.
Right. Oh, I really like that though, that you talked about like, um, I'm thinking of athletes for whatever reason. Like that was the
Sure.
first thing that came to my mind. Like thinking about, I don't
Well, we
remember
were
who it was
talking
the
about
other
the
day.
Bills, so it's
Yeah, well,
easy to
that
think
too.
athletes.
Um, but there was somebody who was asked recently. I think it was a basketball player who was just recently asked in an interview about if the season was a failure. And
Oh,
he posted back to the reporter and was like, "You asked me that last year too." And he's like, "Was Michael Jordan a failure because he didn't, win however many out of however many like
let's say he
championships?"
was,
Like,
yeah, right, exactly. Let's say he was in 11 seasons. He didn't win a championship every season, but he's the
right.
most winningest athlete per se. Yes, I hear you.
And I think
Yes.
that that's so interesting when you think about it. And I loved the comeback. I got to look up who it was, and I'll make sure that I post it to our social media. But um, I just think that that lesson was so powerful. And then he turns back and he says to the reporter, "Did you get a raise this year? Did you get a promotion every year? Like, why are you asking me that? Why is the expectation that I'm just coming in and winning championship after championship after championship? But like, you're not winning every year either in your job, but does it mean that you didn't grow?" And that's the whole thing, right? And then he talks about like how much he took out of the season. I thought that response was brilliant. I thought that interaction in particular was also brilliant because, when you're talking about somebody posts something on social media and they post the end result, right? Um, you're looking at it and you can't really measure someone's grit because you don't know about it unless they're going through it and they're giving you updates. And I do like that. And I guess the other thing too is I wonder if everybody has the same definition of grit. But
Mm,
I was watching a TED talk. Do you know Angela Lee Duckworth? She's a psychologist
I
and an
don't.
author.
Okay.
She's amazing. She wrote a book on grit. She talks about grit. Watch this TED talk. It's great. I'll post that to the
Okay.
social media too. But um I just think that her definition of grit is so great because I think that for me, I always want to know why. You're talking about how you're a curious person. I think her
Sure.
definition, she says she defines grit as a combination of passion and perseverance for long-term goals.
Oh, okay.
And I don't think of grit like that. I think of grit as pushing through, but I don't like that
Mm.
definition. I
Yeah,
don't
it's almost
like,
like pain.
yes,
Like,
and
yeah.
I don't think that learning is always painful. And I think that when she emphasizes that grit is like a stronger predictor of success than talent or intelligence alone, like she found that through research. That to me was
That's
so
cool to
eye
know.
opening. Did you know that?
Only because you mentioned it last time, but like, I, I didn't know that, and it's also sort of powerful because then it's within your control. It's not like based on just genetics. It's not just based on like the nature versus nurture. Anyone can develop the
Right.
capacity to be gritty, and
Yeah.
so it really gives the ownership back to you. Like, anyone could develop this and cultivate this. It isn't just for those of people who can afford a Harvard or Stanford education. And it isn't just for the wealthy elite. It's like anyone among us. And it's also just not for lower class society. Like anybody could do this. Anybody can develop that, which is kind of cool. Also, as you were talking about that, it made me feel better about given the sports metaphors that we've already incorporated. I joke about when someone doesn't win a Super Bowl and it's my team or the championship of that sport, it's a rebuilding year. And I always thought that was kind of like a cop out because it was like an excuse for why they weren't going to perform well or why they did not get to X goal. But essentially, though, that's a really critical element if we are going to get to a Super Bowl or NBA championship or the World Series, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. No, I
Like,
love that you talked about a rebuilding year because that's what Patrick right now is saying about the Patriots. I'm like, y'all have had several rebuilding years in a row now. Like, come on.
I mean, it's really challenging to find another Tom Brady, and
Sure.
and it's not another Tom Brady. You'd find someone of a caliber who can develop the skills and the calm and coolness and rationality under pressure, and like the capacity to perform at that level. I mean, like it's gonna take a long time. You can't, as we're talking, you can't just do it
Yeah, Rome
overnight.
wasn't built in a day. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But going back to Angela Lee Duckworth, tell me more about this TED Talk or
Oh
her
no,
take on grit.
yeah. Well, it's just you were talking about Tom Brady too, and like in our family, we respect Tom Brady. I mean, and I'm talking about my family of origin, like you guys, the people I grew up with. But like we respect Tom Brady, but like I wouldn't want to be his friend, you know? But what I can respect is his grittiness. That man is gritty. Like I see resilience in him. I see grittiness in him. Like I just saw a video of him the other day. He was learning how to play hockey. He was skating wicked fast. Like, and he was talking about how much harder it is when you try it. And I think one of the things Angela Lee Duckworth talks about is consistency and how grit involves staying committed to a particular goal.
Yeah.
But I
Yes.
think the interesting part of grit that I love in her definition is it takes passion and perseverance. So you have to be passionate about it. And it takes an extended period of time. She talks about like there's going to be challenges and there's going to be setbacks. She actually did. I took this test the other day. She just because I wanted to see where I was on her grittiness scale, she developed a grit scale. And it's a psychological test and it's to measure an individual's perseverance and passion for goals.
Okay.
And it was super simple. Like you can just Google it, like Duckworth grit scale or something like that.
Okay.
And I took it and I was really happy with my results. But I still have like growth to do, right? Like
Mm.
I
Okay.
don't remember exactly how, I think it was out of 100 or 100%. And it was like your, um, your grit is in the 90th percentile, essentially. Let's just say,
Okay.
that was the language that it used, but it was like 90% more grit than, whatever other
You're
people or whatever. I
yeah,
forgot how it was
peers.
worded, but
Well, with
I
that said,
I was like,
can you even get 100? Because isn't that the end that like that would contradict being great? Because like then you'd have no
right,
growth capacity, so you can't.
right.
That's like a rigged test, Lane. Like you can't ever get
Good point.
100. I mean, but that's like the
You shouldn't ever get
overachievers in
100.
us, right? Sure,
Yeah,
sure,
well,
exactly.
but if you do, let's say hypothetically, first off, when you take this test, there's no way I think that anybody would really get 100. Like maybe
Okay.
not even Angela Lee Duckworth would get 100. Right?
Okay.
Because to your point, grit, like learning is lifelong, right?
Okay. Yes.
And
Sure.
it requires like cultivating a growth mindset and believing your abilities can continue to develop, but you have to be dedicated and you have to put forth effort. And
Yeah.
I
Effort.
I
Yeah.
think that if you're talking about grit, I think that um it complements resiliency and it almost enhances resiliency. And I think that might
Mm.
even be something that she talks about. But the other thing that I think is really important, and we talked about this in season 1, is reframing failure. as success. And I think as important as it is to learn grit and how to be gritty and how to be resilient, and you were talking about how it's an active, not passive learning experience, I think we also need to continue to practice that failure is an opportunity for improvement rather than a setback.
For sure.
I don't know, what do you think?
Well, there's a lot, and I want to commend Angela Lee Duckworth. I like the fact that you can't just be passionate about something and have grit. It takes the perseverance too. It takes the active participation in it. So the consistency piece that you talked about is huge because we just said gains don't happen overnight. In fact, it's so frustrating for me that you can undo something in such a short time that took such a long time to gain. But like, that's why learning and developing grit is so important because so let's use, for me, it's like a clean house. So I saw a video recently that talked about like what I think people are going to say when they come over and knock on my door and see that people like live here, right? But like it can take my children 5 seconds to dirty up something that took me probably 3 hours to clean. But the point is like I can miss a day, but I shouldn't miss 2 days or 3 days in a row because then it will be difficult and like things will compound and all of that. But the other thing that you had talked about just a second ago was also about failing and reframing that as success. And the only way someone really fails is not trying or doing it at all. And we talked about regret before, but like going back to that power of yet. So but for me, I think the thing I would add or took away from how you were describing grit based on Miss Ducksworth TED Talk is the fact that I'd add follow through. So doing what you say you're going to do. It's not just being consistent, but like whether promising yourself or having an accountability buddy. I have had a few of those. And a friend helped me get in shape for my wedding. He was my accountability buddy. And it's like doing what you say you're going to do. And by doing that for yourself, you can develop grit. By doing that for others, you develop integrity. But with that piece, being dependable and showing up for yourself, even if you can't do all of it, like just doing a portion of it. So cleaning my desk, right? That feels good for me and is how I can develop some of that follow through that I really need. But the other thing that you were talking about is having proper learning spaces and environments to champion the journey and not just the outcome. So everything that happens along the way, not just the end result. And that is what you and this podcast talked about in season 1 of Everything is Learning. And that's what it's really all about. All the steps to get to a breakthrough moment.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool that you took that away. Yeah. I mean, proper learning spaces are huge. And I think for grit in particular, it's going to be really important that you have the right community, that you have the right space, that it's safe. I was also thinking about, while you were saying everything, about Thomas Edison and that quote where he said, like, I learned 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb. And talk about a gritty person. Like, when people ask you, like, who would you want to sit around a table with, living or dead? If you had 10 people, I probably wouldn't choose Edison, but maybe I would. Maybe he's number 11. Maybe he's like the sub, like, for my 10. I think it would be really fascinating to talk to someone like that who really was an innovator, but is somebody who was just like, well, just try again. I'll just try again. And to know that there were people like that when there wasn't a ton of technology or they were inventing major technologies.
Right.
I
Because it was like
wonder too,
starting
like,
from scratch. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I always, my perspective is always like, well, yeah, there was no electricity, so somebody was going to have to invent it. But the reality at the same time is I'm like, oh, maybe I could have invented X, Y, or Z. if I were living in that time. But that's so ridiculous when I think about it too,
I
because
was
I'm
just gonna
like,
say hindsight is
yeah,
2020. Yeah, right, exactly.
right,
You
for
see what it
sure,
looks like
for
now.
sure,
Now, be a time traveler, then you can go back and change that. Yeah, absolutely. Bring that,
for sure. But I think grit is really challenging for a lot of reasons, and one of the things that I think is important too is not just admitting and being vulnerable myself to say like it is not always easy to be gritty, but also to say
No, yeah.
it's not like on a global perspective, grit is not easy. Like on a learning journey, like when you're learning,
Agreed.
it isn't because, for me as a former perfectionist, like a recovering perfectionist, I really think that my relationship with failure was challenging when it came to grit.
Mm,
I just failure was not an option. And I hated that saying. Failure is not an option. And I think that a lot of my learning mentors, especially when it came to athletics, failure was not an option. And there were other things that weren't options too, but failure in particular was constantly reinforced. And I don't know if that was like a tagline of the 90s, but like it seems like a lot of people got that message. I
yeah,
think
fear of
you
failure. Yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely. Right. But like that there was disappointment tagged to it. Whereas if you approach it, I mean, it was probably not this cut and dry for Edison, but if you approach it from a 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb, okay, like
for sure.
this one failed, but maybe the next time won't. And if like you can go into it less disappointed because you learned something from it, like that was it. But for me, the reason I think you and I had that perfectionist mentality was a culture piece too. You know,
Yeah,
like we talk about failure is not an option. It was, you know, there was no room to be less than perfect or whatever that benchmark was. And
growing up,
so
yeah.
yeah, no, I do hear you on that, but please continue what you were saying.
Oh, no, no. I was just thinking about what you had said in our last conversation about monotony. And I think monotony and repetition, like you were talking about cleaning your house. I we we have to do that every night because we have 3 kids under 2.5. We don't have a choice,
Oh man.
like, and I I used to have like a minimalist, very, very clean. I don't even think I needed to really do anything besides do the dishes and wash down the counters at night before kids. But it is kind of monotonous and it is something that you do repetitively, but like, I wasn't cleaning my um ducts, like the air ducts every night. I wasn't like vacuuming underneath my couch every night, like there's also that piece too where things can pile up. Um, and I think about growing up, I learned to get you were talking about how hard it is to like or how easy it is to unlearn something sometimes, like and how quickly that skill can go away.
Yeah.
And I played guitar for I don't know 7, 8 years and played every day. And now I pick one up and I'm back to like infantile level guitar
Yeah.
skills. It's not
Well,
like riding a bike. Not everything is like riding a bike. So that
or
repetition
the
is so
practice,
key.
it is because practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes better. And I feel like that line,
True.
practice makes perfect, should be removed
Mhm.
from language because it's not the reality. You can't, I'm not saying that there isn't ever perfect. But as we're talking, one of my favorite quotes is from a coach, Ladouceur, I believe is how you pronounce his last name. And he talks about how you can't, I don't expect perfection from you, but I expect a perfect effort. And that was so impactful hearing that from me or for
Yeah,
me because I can control how much effort I put in. Like, let's go with academics. I can control
right.
how much I studied or lack thereof. So if I got a B, but I tried and prepared and did everything I could and I know I gave a perfect effort, I can live with that B. I can feel proud of that B. But if I
Right.
slacked off, didn't study, just lucked out, that could have been an A and that would have sat with me. And so I think reframing for perfect effort and not perfection is a really good way to start establishing grit. And
Right.
as far as the monotony and repetition, yeah, I can't say I loved studying. And when I finally developed some good study skills, it really did feel monotonous, but and repetitive. But the end goal, like when you finally got to why you were doing all of these things, felt a lot better. Like I had actually earned it or achieved
Right.
it and could feel passionate about what I was doing. And like
Yeah.
that kept fueling the wanting to get through the monotony and repetition.
I do think having your goal and revisiting it is always really important. It's interesting too, because I was thinking about, we were just talking about cleaning, and we, what we decided to do is do 20 minutes of power cleaning at the end of the night. So, like, to break up that monotony, because we realized that cleaning was taking us like 2 hours, and we were like, this is insane. Like, we need sleep. Like, we have a 4-month-old. We need sleep
Yes.
immediately.
Right.
So, when we did power cleaning, like 20 minutes of power cleaning, we got so much more done than we did in the 2 hours. So sometimes it just takes a reframe. Sometimes it just takes a different kind of motivation, because you can get exhausted. I think exhaustion, I think sometimes distractions get put
Yeah,
into
right.
play,
Two
because
hours when you have 3 kids under 2. Where are you finding 2 hours to commit to one thing? That's crazy. No wonder
and
you
it's
need
not just
20
even that.
minutes.
I think, like, listen, if Gary Clark Jr. came back to Rochester for a concert, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to not do that night. I'm not going to clean. I'm not going to do it,
Sure.
because that's a distraction that I will willingly do. And I think we need breaks too and stuff like that. But I
For
just
sure.
mean, I think, the perfectionism, I think monotony or repetition of something, I think distractions, I think exhaustion. Exhaustion is so key, because sometimes you just need a break. But I
Yeah.
think commitment is also really hard nowadays. I think of the statistics when it comes to anything, when it comes to commitment nowadays, especially in American culture. And I just think, and I think you hear it from older people, um, there's just no commitment nowadays. And I don't mean to mock, because I believe that in a lot of situations as well. But I think all of those things make it really challenging to be gritty.
I agree with the commitment piece that you just named. I think the way you and I are defining commitment, and this is going back to a previous comment that I said, is the follow through. So do what you
Yeah.
say you're going to do. Whereas
Yeah.
from an older
Is the
generation,
value.
commitment is like you owe something to this person. I'm going to use work as a good
Yeah.
example. I do not, work gets the best of me because they give me a paycheck. But if I
Mm-hmm.
were to pass away tomorrow, work would
Yep.
replace me. And maybe there would be a
Dang it.
nice email that went out and there would be a few people who would mourn my loss. But the reality is, I owe them only what they're contracting and paying me to do. I do not owe
Right.
them my life's work. And if their
Right.
needs and my needs are differing, then I no longer need to stay committed. With that said, I'm not going to
Mm.
not do my job, but I also don't think I need to give an employer 40 years unless I'm truly passionate about the work. And with
Right.
that said, I think it's amazing when people find something that they want to do for even 20 plus years. But I think that was very common for the older generation. But there were things like
Yeah.
pensions. There were things like unions. There were things like um uh
Different
401k
motivators.
matching to the exact
Yeah.
same amount. Spousal inclusion and
Free
benefits.
education. Yeah. Right.
Tuition reimbursement, right? Like there were
Yeah.
things that unfortunately when push comes to shove and cost cuts are made, those things don't, I don't, in my opinion, reign true any longer in this capitalist society. So it's really hard to say
Right.
committed in that way. But follow through, I agree. I think that's an important piece and how we can distinguish commitment. Um, I also
Yeah.
think
Thank you for saying
it
that.
take it takes the vulnerability piece pops up again. It takes
Yeah.
um for in developing grit and being committed, Uh, Authenticity and vulnerability plays a role, but so does courage. I don't think we've talked about that yet,
Mm,
but I think courage is a factor of grit. And as I'm talking about courage, it makes me think of a book that I like to read to my children called Be Brave Little One by Marion Richmond. And it talks about be brave to
yeah.
stand up when you and say what you know, and then be brave to stand out when it isn't for you. And like there are components where it puts you in a scenario of grit, of developing resilience, but it requires
Yeah.
action. And I also think, and I know we talked about a little bit about this earlier, where you were how you thought of grit was more pushing through. And
Yeah.
I had mentioned, oh, that makes me think of pain. And I do think that learning grit can come through pain and maybe even trauma. But the difference between trauma is you can't cope with it rationally. Like in a traumatic event, you're focused on safety and survival. You're not learning
Right.
in that moment because you're in an emotional state and you're feeling. And
Right.
the fact that you are in that safety and survival mode, but at the same time you don't let the trauma beat you, that's grit. That's where it comes up, and you have to feel it. An example, I saw this, I believe it was on LinkedIn actually. I saw a video where it was two men talking about trauma, and the guy gives an
Mhm.
example of a person holding a cup of milk, and then out of
I know
nowhere
exactly
someone
where
pees
you're
in it. And you can't, like, he talks about you can't take the pee out. It happened. You can't rationalize the pee out of milk, right? So, like, you can feel upset about it. You have to start over with a new cup of milk. But I was just like, wow, yeah, exactly. And when people talk about, like, pushing people to overcome trauma, like, it's not a rational thing. It's not done that easy. But people who are able to feel and cope and learn to develop strategies to work through their trauma, like that's amazing. I mean, for me,
Yeah.
my recent birth experience was a really traumatic experience, and as we were saying things about the milk and the pee, and it made me think about the consent as tea video, which I don't know if you've seen it, but if you haven't, it's
No.
not necessarily specific to grit, but it's really good, and you should definitely watch it. And would love for you
Oh,
to put a link on the social media because that's a really key takeaway too. But um,
okay.
getting back to like challenge and pain and trauma and being resilient, like I have flaws from my trauma and I recognize that. It can
Mm,
often be challenging depending on the who I'm with. So I try and vocalize like what triggers, which I know you have talked about triggers before on the podcast, but I try and talk about what my triggers are and red flags are with those I care about. But in my traumatic experience, learning can only come from reflection and feeling it. And for many folks,
right.
myself included, surviving trauma helps me be passionate about something and persevere through that. So going back to what Angela Duckworth said, it was like the passion and perseverance. Like, absolutely. It I see it with people who've lost loved ones. I've seen it with people like me who had traumatic birth experiences and still wanting to grow a family, and what that looks like, and good health care for women and whatnot. But I guess as I'm talking through this, I'm wondering, how would you teach grit to people? Like, what would the stepstones look like from that perspective for you?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to acknowledge, like, you bringing up trauma, I think is really important. And I didn't really consider that in the beginning, thinking about grit and resilience, but I think that everybody at some point goes through a traumatic experience. So the fact that you're applying and acknowledging, I think acknowledgement is so important in today's culture and
Mm,
society to
thank you.
like say, like, I see you out there and I know that you're going through something and I can't possibly know exactly because it was only your experience. But I think the choice that you're talking about is really important. And the learning when you're out of that traumatic state is important. So thank you for saying that, because I also went through a traumatic birth experience and other traumas too, but I think it's important to talk about that because not everybody has a space or a community to talk about that. So thank you for bringing that up. In terms of how
Thanks
would
for
I teach grit
acknowledging.
to people, I will say I have done that in and out of a classroom, but I'm starting to try to figure out how to do that with myself and with others. And I mean, you know this, like I wanted to do my doctorate in personalized learning.
Yes.
Like I wanted that to be my thesis. So for me, just like anything else, I think personalized learning is the best way to go about it. I think one-on-one learning when it comes to something as important as grit is so important. I think you can obviously teach grit, in larger groups and things like that. But I think if you really, 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 like if it were me, if I really want to teach grit to people, it has to be personalized for me, as the learning mentor in that particular situation. And even for myself, I think about like, how can I improve my grit? I think you have to start with interest. I think you have to start with what you're passionate about. We've talked about how Angela Duckworth talks about passion. And I think starting with just being curious and asking, like, what are you passionate about? And I think that's why personalized learning can be really tricky in traditional education systems, because people think that they can't teach geometry in a personalized way, just as an example. But you can. And I think you're not going to necessarily be passionate about every single thing you learn. But if we're
Right.
talking about in adulthood and we're getting people ready for, what it is like to be an adult in today's world, I think a lot of things are motivated by passion. So grit might be easier. It's important to teach it at a younger age, but I think it is necessary that you can continue to cultivate that and kind of flex your gritty muscle throughout life. So,
Sure.
start with something that someone's passionate about, and then, explaining how to practice it. So, like, let's just say we've been talking about football. Let's say, somebody is super passionate about football. Start asking questions like, why are you into football? Like, what is it that you want to learn more? And then, maybe it's a particular skill, or maybe it's, my, my husband and his friends, they have so much what I call quote unquote, like useless knowledge about sports. And I'm like, can you remember the grocery list, please? Why do you know all these facts about some random player that people don't even really know their name on a global scale? And you know those statistics, or you know statistics from 45 years ago, but you didn't remember the watermelon. So it just, I think passion and I think internal motivation is so important when teaching grit. So,
It's true.
you know, taking interest also, like as the learning mentor, like taking interest and telling the person or telling yourself if you're trying to be gritty, I think practicing and modeling practicing. So, like let's say somebody's like, oh, I really want to learn more stats on football. Okay.
Yeah, well, I
So
mean, like
like
a
you can,
watermelon can't get you 20 fantasy points. So I get why watermelon might not be high on the priority list, but no, I get where you're
sure. And
coming
that's
from.
genius. Like, oh my gosh, that's so funny. Fantasy anything is genius. Like when it comes to sports,
Well,
fantasy's
yeah,
great
but I
too.
mean, like it's
But
gamification, and like if you
yes,
can find ways, because you were talking about personalized learning, if you can find ways to make it fun, gamify it, then yeah, I mean,
yes,
so like with geometry, as soon as you said that, and just because we're talking a lot about sports in this, I was thinking about
yes,
basketball and how you like the bank shot, or where you are in the shooting court. Like
love.
if
Hmm.
you're a kinesthetic learner and you happen to like basketball, that's the perfect way to learn geometry.
Right. Yeah, and like you're talking about like so we were just talking about football stats. Like if that's something that somebody is interested in, you can have uh, through the lens of that passion, you can teach grittiness. You can, practice as a sports announcer. Like pretend
Sure.
you're a sports announcer. let's go to the library. We'll pick up some books so you can do, like learn some stats. Let's YouTube some athletes talking about their stats. Let's go to, the Football Hall of Fame in Canton. Loves
All
that, by
great
the way.
things. Well, I think that's a wonderful lesson plan. With that said, as soon as you were talking about that, so like statistics, right? You don't like, I love The Office, and I was thinking about Kevin, how he can't do like simple math until you put food as the analogy because he's so food motivated. And that's exactly what I was like. I am so food motivated. You ask me to do pies or like learning fractions, right? With a pie, heck, or
Yeah.
pizza. I could definitely visualize that.
Game. I'm
So,
game.
anyway, yes, please continue.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of people can be gritty when it comes to pizza, right? Like if I really need to know my
Yes.
fractions and stuff, but I'm food motivated, absolutely. But and I think that's the thing too is sometimes I don't think people understand that when you're learning something new, if you're personalizing it to yourself, it can literally be through any avenue. Like
Mm,
that's the exciting part about learning. Like then you can connect it to different areas of life, right? Like let's talk about, you were just talking about pizza. So and you were talking about formula for pie. Okay? So if we're talking about all these pieces, well, then you can just start from scratch, literally start from scratch, like make the pizza, right? Then you can design the pizza. Then you can write a fantasy story about pizza, but you have to use pie and circumference in your story. Like there are so many ways that you can take this and you can do it. Um, like if you're learning stats, let's just go back to that analogy again. So you're learning stats. There's no way that your brain is going to pick up, 1,000 stats in X amount of time. Sure. Like, and that was one of the things Angela Duckworth talks about too, is like timeline. And it's
okay.
not automatic. And that's a really hard part of grit. But I think by connecting it to other areas of life, like whatever it is you're learning. So if you're trying to memorize statistics, you're going to have to do it in different ways so that you internalize what you're taking on. Or like, let's say you want to learn how to hit a ball, or let's say you want to learn how to draw. Um, you know, all of those things that you're learning because you're passionate about them, you can find ways to be passionate about the rock cycle. Like you can. I know that sounds crappy, but you can. Like I used to teach the rock cycle and I was like, this is so ridiculous. Like these kids do not need to know this stuff. But it's so fun if you're like, hey, ever been to a volcano? Like,
Yeah,
you know
right.
what I mean?
Or,
Like,
or having The Rock, Dwayne The Rock Johnson, teach about the rock cycle and doing it like in the voice of Maui with the volcano and all of that. Yeah,
right.
no, I hear you.
Like there are
It's
so
true.
many ways
You can make it fun.
to connect your learning to different areas of life and getting some version of passion put into it. And
Sure.
I think that is really important with grit is by, if you're learning something that you're not passionate about, it feels monotonous. Connecting it to other areas of your life where you have been passionate about something, you can be passionate about implementing a strategy. You can be passionate about a topic. You can be passionate about a person. And I'm
I can be
telling you, if
passionate
you do
about
that,
compliance and rule following.
you could be a
Anyhow,
compliance expert and really passionate about it. Like,
right?
you can. Like,
I can
this
love
is the cool
grammar and
thing.
be an editor. Yes, I hear
Yes,
you.
like, and that's the thing. And, you talked about practice. I believe that practice doesn't make perfect, but it always results in learning. And I think
Yes.
have you ever heard of Eric Erickson? He's like a cognitive psychologist.
No.
Okay, so he discovered that you need to practice something for 10,000 hours to master it, to become like mastery level in something.
Is it like
And I
T-shaped
think
knowledge?
that is,
So like deep level is the part, the T part, the 10,000 hours?
I'm not 100% sure what you mean.
Okay, I'll we can revisit it, but essentially, like T-shaped knowledge is I know a little about a lot, and then I know the bottom of the T is I know a lot about one thing.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Then yes. Then yes.
Okay,
So like, and his point too in the research was also about how like people do, to your point, like people know a little about a lot, but there are so many people who don't have mastery in something. And so the research proved that you need 10,000 hours in order to be at mastery level of something. So just
Wow.
thinking about that concept in order to get gritty and determine if that is your goal to master something, that is, I think, really enlightening for that timepiece that Angela Lee Duckworth talks about. Is it's gonna take time to grow grit. How do you grow grit? Like you personally?
Consistency. Finding
Okay.
something that makes me feel motivated and want to work toward. I also being vulnerable and like when I make a mistake, so I have to accept my flaws and that I will make a mistake, but that shouldn't, it should not stop me. I have to-do lists, and so I try and carve out the end goal into smaller, more manageable chunks and work toward those. Those are some of the ways I do it. What about you?
Yeah. Um. Yeah. I mean, I think I practice a lot. I'm honest with myself. I reflect. Um. I think I accept myself, flaws and all. I also, I don't have a problem with telling myself that I need to change. I think um I think that I find value in the fact that I want to grow, and I in order to do that, that vulnerability piece that you've talked about before, like I need to be able to be vulnerable with myself and say, I did not do that right. How can I, do it differently, do it better? And I think I have to draw inspiration from places when I get worn out, and I know that. So whether I turn to movies or I turn to people, whatever it is, I surely think that passion definitely plays a part in grit. Um, I think I think self-compassion is part of it too, and I think empathy. I think both of those are
Oh,
critical roles in the learning process.
yeah.
And I don't think we talk enough about self-compassion. I don't think we talk about compassion for others enough. Especially in this world of immediacy and maybe impulsivity and not really thinking. And I think empathy is something else that is very important to grit, but is just important to learning as well.
That's a really fascinating concept. Yeah, I agree. And would be interested in talking about that more if you're open to it.
Oh, yeah, I would love to do that. Let's do that next time. What do you think?
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to
All
it.
right,
Well,
cool. I'll
thanks
see
for
you then.
this. Talk to you later.
Thank you for being here. All right, bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Everything is Learning. We're so glad you joined us.
Be sure to subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.